This is Deb Donig with Technically Human, a podcast about ethics and technology, where I ask what it means to be human in the age of tech. Each week, I interview industry leaders, thinkers, writers, and technologists, and I ask them about how they understand the relationship between humans and the technologies we create. We discuss how we can build a better vision for technology, one that represents the best of our human values. My guest today is Megs Shah. Megs Shah is a globally recognized technology leader, social entrepreneur, and TEDx speaker with over 20 years experience architecting enterprise-level AI solutions and building innovative technology platforms for Fortune 100 companies and startups. A pioneer in ethical AI development, Megs has cultivated a deep understanding of how artificial intelligence can be harnessed to protect vulnerable populations while maintaining stringent privacy and security standards. As the founder and CEO of the Parasol Collective, she leads the development of Ruth, the world's first trauma-informed AI guardian, and Safe Connect, transforming how technology supports survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking. Megs has been featured in Forbes Women, recognized by UN Women globally, and highlighted in Euro News Week for her groundbreaking work at the intersection of AI and social impact. She regularly shares her expertise on ethical AI development and deployment, trauma-informed technology, and digital safety through speaking engagements and workshops worldwide. Drawing from her extensive experience across several industries and startups, she brings enterprise-level AI governance expertise to humanitarian challenges, demonstrating how cutting-edge technology can be wielded as a force for positive social change. Hi, Meg.
Hey, how are you, Jen?
Okay, let's get into it. Megs, your work sits at a fascinating intersection, trauma advocacy, technology design, crisis response, and AI. And I think that many people move through one of those worlds, but rarely do I see people moving through all four. So what's the through line that you would draw connecting your own path to the work that you're doing now with Parasol Cooperative and that as the umbrella for the product that we're talking about today?
So, my journey in technology, I was always an Uber nerd. 25 years spent building technology products for really large companies, Fortune 500 companies, and it was largely focused on like data platforms, algorithms, app development, you name it, right? And these were all things that were used by millions of people. And my story, my personal story of being a child sexual abuse survivor has led me to other lived experiences throughout my life. And during COVID, they both kind of collided, where I was supporting a group of single moms on Facebook. A large portion of them were South Asian and they were in very violent homes. And so during the lockdowns, the first question in my mind was, oh my God, how are they going to reach out for help with their abuser being home? At least they had some reprieve to be able to go to a grocery store or something. And so at that point, I started down just asking questions about, okay, where can we see the issues in this space? And being a technologist, and especially in product development, you get curious about the problem space. But before we got into the problem space in this case, it was largely about making sure I wasn't bringing my own biases into the situation from my experiences. And so started speaking with survivors and confirming some of the things I already knew, and some things new that I kind of uncovered as part of the dialogue. And we identified basically two different types of barriers that survivors had in this sort of journey, which I've personally faced myself. First of which was sort of this internal shame and self blame that you go through, and this belief that if I say something, it's going to get worse. Right. And then there's sort of these accidental things that occur throughout your life, which you don't quite know that connect to your prior experiences as well. And so shame sort of became internalized for me in many ways, so long so that I didn't even disclose what happened to me to my parents for over 30 plus years, right? I told them right around COVID that I had been sexually molested as a child. And, it was something that kind of took them back a little. But the second part, which was the systemic barriers, were the real ones that I was trying to figure out. Well, there's has to be people out there being able to help with these types of situations. And I quickly learned after talking with a lot of survivors that they are always on hold and they call hotlines. And when I spoke with organizations that kind of monitored the hotlines and were servicing the hotlines, a lot of those reps were actually burning out because of just the sheer amount of trauma that they hear day in, day out. And so the long wait times with the burnout was one part. The other part was really language services. So many organizations were English speaking or Spanish speaking, or, in South Asian diaspora, we have a lot of people that have so many different languages that they speak. And language lines, they do help, but they're not always available. And so this sort of conglomerate of issues that these institutes were facing kind of became a question in my mind. Is I've been building tech, and technology is very powerful. A lot of these barriers that were systemic barriers could be broken down by building a technology product of some kind. And what I quickly learned was there's possibility for us to do this in an empathetic manner. And with my experience, I knew something that I would want to hear as a survivor needed to be part of that equation so that I could be encouraged enough to reach out to someone for help. And that's really where everything kind of started. Was like, I feel like COVID was the catalyst, and everything else that followed suit was the domino effect of that.
I so appreciate you bringing lived experience to the table and building a technology. I think that that's one thing that in my conversations where I see products missing the mark goes consistently wrong. And from what I've heard, at least, there's a moment for you when this lived experience that happened for you during your childhood connected with another lived experience, which is the childhood of your son. And I want to ask about that particular specific moment where those two things met. Because what I've heard is that you had, as a parent, become concerned about your teenage son's online safety, particularly around sextortion. And I can imagine from what you're saying that you had this childhood experience. Now your son is undergoing a childhood experience in a technological environment, quite different from what your childhood environment was like. And in many ways, but more specifically, the way that I'm referencing is the relationship to technology and the technological environment in which childhood now happens. Can you tell listeners a little bit about that origin story and what your experience taught you that perhaps 20 years of enterprise AI work might not have?
Yeah, I mean, it gets very visceral and very personal when it comes to your kids. You want to protect them in every way possible. But for survivors that have lived experiences, they bring a whole new level of paranoia to the situation. And I think in my case, it was more my son, he loved gaming. What teenager boy doesn't, right? He he came to me one day and he said, Mom, can I be on Discord? Can I use it? And we have a good dialogue at home. So he came to me and asked if we could actually use it instead of just starting to use it. And I said, well, let me do some research and then we can talk about it. And I started going down the path because I had been working in this space for so long. I knew some of the tech facilitated abuse that occurs on these platforms. So I wanted to approach this in a way that wasn't just a shutdown conversation, but more of a dialogue that I could have with him to help him understand what my reasoning was and how to actually be safe, because we can't be hermits either in like the age of technology, right? And so I started asking like this, I'm just going to say an AI chatbot at the time. And when I asked about sextortion, they were using keyword sort of filters on what was being provided back as responses at the time. And the moment I used the word sextortion, it basically said it was out of policy. Now, I had been following large language models for a very long time. And I knew the foundational models could really do what I needed it to do, was to explain how to actually have this dialogue. And so I started just developing something to answer my questions off of an AWS tool that was there. And as a result, I had uncovered one issue even during the work that we were doing first 2 years of Parasol. It was sort of an aha moment for me in that, because the thing that I was trying to do was to educate as a parent, right? But at the same time, that gap of access and the information and those systemic sort of issues that we identified earlier, those could also be solved through the large language models that were coming out. And so, you know, I think optimizing for efficiency is great, using keywords is great, but it was not the answer. And so I needed to build something that could basically be a parent in the situation necessary. Now, it's not a replacement, right? In any way, I wouldn't expect my son to go to an AI to answer these questions. I would hope he'd come to me. But in the moment, when you're in that moment, sometimes it's so much harder, even as adults, to actually know how to navigate that situation, which is what I was facing in that moment. And so I started to build out the tool that would help me have those dialogues. And then it just so happened that we knew this other issue existed, and I started to build in the safeguards, the information, and the training that advocates typically receive into it, and sent it out to a group of advocates and survivors and said, "Hey, I'm just trying something. Can you take a look at this and tell me whether there's viability here?" And immediately, we had people that spoke Hindi that were trying it. We had people that were, English speaking that were decades of experience with advocacy work. We were trying it, and they came back and said, "No, this has definitely got something here." And so we didn't launch immediately. We took the time to figure out what are those standards of care that we need to be incorporating? What are those questions we need to be asking in terms of safety for the survivor? Because, if they go to a website to ask about all these things, can it be tracked back to them in any way? And so taking all of those things that I would have been afraid of, I actually tried to put in the safeguards to this AI as a starting point. And so designing for it became so much easier because the intent for us was to make sure that the lived experiences that people have, along with the advocacy work that occurs to support them, is both added into this. And that's really where the antithesis and the birth of Ruth, I suppose, came
And can
about.
you tell me a little bit about the name itself? Where did you get the name and what does it signify?
Yeah, so it's funny. We actually did this whole campaign in February around the name as well because I'd been asked this question. First of all, Ruth is just a very disarming name, but there's a lot of amazing women that have a legacy of doing just amazing things for the community that are named Ruth, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and even in the biblical reference, there's Ruth in there. But what struck me the most was when I started looking up the name to see the meaning of it. Because in India, our names have meaning. No matter what name you are, there's some sort of meaning attached to it. And I thought, well, Ruth wasn't really a word, was it? And turns out it is actually an old English word that's been deprecated from our dictionary. And it's actually, I believe it's a noun, if I'm not mistaken. And it means the person who can't look away when something bad is happening. And it just fits so well with what we were trying to do because here's a room full of people that were answering questions for us that had these lived experiences that they brought in, and they became advocates and they didn't look away from all the bad things that were happening to them. And so the name just felt right for us.
What a phenomenal story, and the thought that went into that is just so striking to me. I want to dig in to some of what you said in the first part of your response, because this is a show on ethics and this is a show about
Yeah.
technology. And this is something that so clearly is in both of those buckets and brings those two things together. What were some of the technical issues and technical challenges that you came across as you were building Root? And what were some of the ethical questions and ethical challenges that came up?
I mean, when we develop products, any product developer can tell you that they go through and understand what are ways that their product will help people, right? But what we don't do often enough is understand how it could harm people. And that's actually where we started was we kind of worked from a position of an abuser coming in and looking at a computer. Can they figure out this person was on this chat? If they were, what's the first thing to get compromised as part of the control dynamics that occur in those abusive relationships? For instance, those two first questions were largely, can we make sure that there's no history left back? Can we try to make sure that as they come to the application that there's no login needed? Because a lot of times logins are things that are compromised and easily cracked. And we make sure that we are very transparent about what this is and what it isn't. And then how do we put in those sort of responses, the features that we develop that can actually ease someone's fear, but increase their trust within the system. And that all has to start before we even start writing one line of code, in my opinion. And so the ethical considerations here, especially around AI, everybody that I've worked with in the past, I worked in the pharma industry. And so we've been using artificial intelligence for a very long time for research purposes, for commercial identification, things of that nature. But never in this context, right? It was a highly regulated industry. And the experience of trauma brings a whole new level of dialogue that we need to be having. So, making sure that the language that's being spoken, there's two parts to language, right? One is the spoken language, which is, the localization, etc. But then there's the trauma informed language, which is really the core of how advocacy works, where you respond in a way that doesn't re-traumatize the person, but at the same time, you're giving them enough motivation to take the next best action that is safer and healthier for that person. And so, in order to do that, we had to make sure that we started from sort of this place of fear almost. What is the core shame, fear, judgment, et cetera, that we need to be removing from this equation? And that all started with language and trauma informed language side of it. And then we started to build out from there. What are those features, technically speaking, that could create an environment of danger for these individuals? Because it is very dangerous for them when they're trying to leave or trying to find help. And so those sort of started out as our core foundation in terms of how we built this. I'm also a fan of data minimization. And that means I don't need to get information from you in order to help you. So the barrier for survivors a lot of times is we ask them for their name, their address, their phone number, all of this information that is absolutely unnecessary to get to resources that might be able to help them. Right. So can we do something where we can minimize what we're asking for, but still maximize the effect that it could have on them as a result of giving that information?
I want to ground listeners in the scale of the problem that you're trying to solve. Because your organization points out an asymmetry. The experience of trauma is universal, but access to support for trauma is not universal. Billions of people are going to experience trauma in their lifetime. And while the overwhelming majority of those in crisis never receive adequate care, can you help us understand what that gap actually looks like in practice and why it persists? Is it cost? Is it stigma? Workforce shortage? Language barriers? Geography? All of the above?
All of the above. The challenges a lot of times is, let me maybe take a step back here. So shame is the primary barrier that I've seen in survivors. And that could be for any issue. And in my case, anyway, the shame was so overwhelming as a child that I carried it into my late adulthood, right? So when we talk about barriers, those internal barriers are the hardest to break down, right? The second part of it, which, for what it's worth, the magnitude of the issues that everyone's facing today, especially mental health challenges with the amount of stuff that's happening, the anxiety associated with everything, the navigation of our emotions, if we're always constantly in the fight, flight, freeze mode, is much harder to navigate, even if you had the resources available to you, right? Like, I've been fortunate enough to have all of these resources to go to do trauma support for myself in this process. But so many people are not fortunate enough to have that ability to do that. Some struggle to even have health insurance, right? So I think there's a systemic side to this in terms of the economic factors, the socio, sort of society expectations that we have of what's acceptable to go to get trauma support versus not. And then, in some cases, like we hear a lot about men as well that have been abused. They don't say it because, a lot of times they're told, well, you're a man, you should suck it up. Right. And I don't think abusive behavior is any specific gender, socioeconomic status, or anything. When you experience trauma, it is an unmet need that is not going to leave you until you resolve it. right? And so getting pathways and navigating to those resources that can help you to do that, whether that's paid or free, are both equally important. And I think the reason we built what we did with Ruth is to make sure that we can break down some of those barriers that people might have in order to get access to that information. And a large part of what you would find online is Google search at the time, right? And if you had great SEO, your resources were popped up on the list, right? We had a survivor we interviewed who searched for something for a South Asian diaspora in Houston, but ended up getting an organization in New York because they had a really great SEO. Now they called them up and they asked about how they could get assistance. Then the person asked, well, do you live in New York City? And they're like, no, I live in Houston. And the response was, I'm sorry, we can't help you because we only serve the New York City area, but here's an organization you can call. So now they have to call another organization, re sort of tell their story, right? That then re traumatizes them in doing so. So, why can't we build something that can give them those localized access and resources that they don't have to constantly repeat their story over and over again with? And that's really where we started to navigate towards was those personalized situations, because each situation can be different. But in those situations, what are the right resources for you in order to get the help you need?
I wanted to go back to something that you had said that struck to me a balance between the challenges, on the one hand, of a technological product in the current technological environment that we're in, and on the other hand, a problem or a barrier specific to questions of abuse and trauma. Because one thing that struck me immediately upon spending some time with Ruth myself is how different Ruth's architecture appears from mainstream AI products. As you pointed out, many AI products and systems are built around accounts, retention, optimization, data capture, persistent memory. All of these things fall into the larger bucket of data capture and data harvesting. And Ruth emphasizes no login, anonymity, minimal retention, no tracking or tracing. And you've mentioned how important that is in terms of ensuring the safety of the people who use your platform, and how foundational privacy is, especially because many listeners may not realize that for someone experiencing abuse, all of those things can be used to surveil them by their abuser. Surveillance is not abstract to this group of people because a browser history, location data, shared devices, call logs, or stored conversations can create real danger. And so I'm wondering for you whether or not there were tensions around what data to collect in order to provide the service that you're trying to provide versus trying to keep people safe. And if possible, I'd love you to also talk about why, other than surveillance capitalism, other technological or AI products don't similarly use these techniques if, as you may or may not have found out, it is possible to provide services without that kind of data harvesting.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to answer it in two parts. First, just focusing on the fact that, when we talk about product design, a lot of times we have general UX assumptions, right, that we take into account, as well as revenue generation side of it, right, which is really the capitalistic aspect of what we're seeing today. For a product developer, a large portion of what we try to do is understand the user we're going to serve. And let's take a general AI chatbot, for instance. Standard assumption is I want to make sure we have the accounts, the history, personalization, so I, as a product developer, can learn from it. Right. The challenge for survivors is when you have an account, when you have a history, when you have something that's stored, it can be subpoenaed. And when you subpoena something, it could be used against them in a court of law that could intentionally harm them in a way that is irreversible. And then the capitalistic side of it, you do need to make money. We're a nonprofit, they're a for profit. Both of us need the money to operate, right? So, in a realistic lens, they do need to figure out how to do that. Is there a balance between the two? Absolutely. The way that we designed it, we wanted to make sure that the safety risks were taken into consideration well in advance instead of after the fact. And I think not having the very population that you're affecting as part of that design process, not just as user interviews, but actually there. to kind of convey what the consequences would be if you have certain features in that product. It's a huge consideration that we're missing out on from a product development standpoint. We're seeing it every day in the news today, right? The other side of it, which is the capitalistic aspect of it, we, in the Silicon Valley, the saying is, if it's free, you're the product. And I hate that saying, but unfortunately, it's true, right? We're giving away all of this data to get a free service. We can still give a free service to survivors. And in our case, we decided to go down the route of building out a B2B offering. So we could have a revenue generating side and we could have a philanthropic side all under the nonprofit that we've built, right? For us, building and getting profit doesn't mean we distribute it. We reinvest it into the program, right? And I think that's a misconception people have about nonprofits is that we don't make any money. That's not true. We do make money and we do need money to operate, but we can do it mindfully and thoughtfully in how we actually build things as services that we offer to the community. And so co-designing with survivors, understanding the issues that you're dealing with, then thinking about, okay, well, if these are the things that I'm solving for the main persona that I'm building out for, how can I make sure that I build in something that can actually bring in value, both from a monetary standpoint, but also for potential customers that are willing to pay for a service like this at a larger scale. And so we built out what we call Ruth Plus version, which is like an organizational SaaS offering that was where we were generating revenue that could inform operations of a hotline, for instance, or that could inform policy for an organization, or that could inform the types of content and the media that those content need to be delivered in. So there's value we can add where generation of revenue is not off the table. But when we talk about end consumers that we're really affecting, and in this case, it ends up being a huge amount of users that you're affecting, you should be taking into account their safety first instead of just getting to the bottom line of being able to make revenue.
I want to talk about that um, last point, which is effectiveness, because in business context, sometimes effect is translated as number of users, number of people served, etc. And in looking through your materials, I see that your materials report hundreds of thousands of private crisis support interactions across dozens of languages and countries. And those are significant numbers. And if it were purely business metrics that you were seeking to be able to report out, that alone would be impressive. But I imagine that the harder question for an organization like the Parasol Collective and for a product like Ruth is that you're not trying to make an impact in the sheer number of people who come and use the product, but instead you are trying to measure whether or not the interaction was actually helpful. And that's a much harder thing to measure using the tools and the instruments that we have to be able to ask that question. The proxies, I think, are a lot more intangible. And to use words that I credit Daniel Kahneman and Tal Tversky for providing for me, the heuristic around that can be a lot more abstract. So, how do you measure success in a space where the meaningful metrics may not be the number, but rather more ephemeral concepts that are harder to measure, like trust or stabilization, clarity or safety, rather than clicks?
Yeah, so I think from a response safety standpoint, which is one of the primary concerns that people have today, we actually hired somebody who broke every single chatbot out there. And he actively breaks it every single day and gives me a heart attack every Thursday, I will say, just because I want to make sure that it's safe for everyone. But for me, the measurement really comes down to voluntary feedback surveys that we're seeing from people that have been using Ruth. So within our chat interface that's there, regardless of where you get access to Ruth, there's a quick exit option, which is for emergencies where you need to get off the page quickly. And then there's a happy path of ending and closing a chat. And we've had over 5,000 people fill out surveys, and we are at a 92% helpful or mostly helpful rating, which that's the number I care about, right? The most. And on top of that, people are actually sending in written feedback, right? So a user There's a couple of feedback points that always kind of shake me up a little, but one of them was, after years of this person not being able to open up, they finally had the words they needed in order to do so. So a lot of times it was the formation of the words that caused the issue. And so the users that are actually voluntarily giving us information, because our ethos is never because we helped you, can you tell your story? Because that's actually it's manipulation and exploitation in a different form, right? So if they're voluntarily telling us, here's what I think your product did, for me as a person, that means the world to me in terms of efficacy. Because if you're able to help them navigate a situation and have their own agency to navigate it, that's really where we need to be with these types of products. That said, it doesn't mean I don't track all the other metrics either, right? I do track the number of conversations that people are having, how many messages were exchanged, what's the duration that we're seeing for those messages come through. And we're starting to finally get to a point where we're going to disclose this to end users here very shortly, is that we want to be able to derive insights like the types of issues people are discussing. Are there cross sectional issues that we need to be addressing with partners so that we can come together as a cooperative? Right? Because if we start to cooperate in the different issues, because a person that may have family violence, for instance, that's kind of categorized under domestic violence, right? They may have a higher chance of a child being a runaway. And that runaway child could end up being a substance abuse user, could have potentially be trafficked as a result of the runaway action because they're relying on strangers to be nice to them. And I think when we start to understand the interconnectedness of these issues from the transcripts that we do have, we can then start to understand how we can address these issues more systemically from a policy standpoint, but also from services standpoint, right? And in our case, we don't store any transcripts past maximum of 7 days. And for our instance, as well as the National Domestic Violence Hotline, we only store it for 3 days. So we have to be able to derive insights without compromising the privacy and safety of those individuals, but be able to inform, let's say, financial institutions of potential trends that we're seeing, to inform legislators of the issues that really need attention and where we see some gaps in those localizations that are there. So there's aspects of efficacy that go towards more of the actions we can take for prevention. And then there's those metrics, I would say, from a success standpoint, that help you really understand, is this a product market fit or not? And both of those are important.
You mentioned the person who routinely breaks something in Ruth every couple of days or every week or so. And I was very intrigued by that. I work in AI ethics and I specifically focus on the job market in ethics and technology, responsible technology and public interest technology. And one concern that that research has elevated for me is that responsibility in tech is increasingly getting channeled into technical fixes and far less today into the more normative or political questions that I think are equally, or if not more, important to ask. Those questions include deeper considerations of power and governance and labor and public accountability, which get sidelined in the service of providing that technical fix. I'm interested in hearing what gets broken and what the kind of structure of breaking things looks like in the context of your work. But also, I'm interested in hearing you talk a little bit about whether you think the mainstream AI sector is asking the right or the wrong questions about how to fix things or how to move technological products toward a more efficacious, less harmful kind of facility. And if you do think that they're asking some of the wrong questions, what are the questions that they should be asking?
I mean, I think from the testing side of it, I will say, I firmly believe that when we build something, we should try to make sure that it's safe. And the way we do that is by breaking it, right? Like, as long as you have the questions being asked of situations that are super, super edge cases of harm, that's when we start to really see where our systems are failing, right? So that was one of the first things we focused on, was to ensure asking the questions around the situations. What are some of the darkest moments someone can be in? And honestly, the person we hired, I had told him he needed to we needed to get him a therapist because of all of the things that he was either reviewing and or actually conducting with the chatbot, right? Interestingly, the first week he came on, he apologized. He's like, "I'm really sorry. I'm gonna be doing a lot of crazy things with this chatbot." And I literally told him, I said, I hired you to do that. Like, I want you to go out and be the person that is being nefarious, that is trying to ask those really harmful questions of people. And, it takes you to a very dark place. But at the same time, it's critical for us to do that so that we build in those safeguards proactively. So that's the first side of it, right? As far as whether the industry is asking the questions that are right or wrong, I wouldn't say they're necessarily wrong. I would say they're incomplete, right? Because we build, and I've done this for decades, right? We build with beer goggles on many times. And that means everything looks great on paper. Everything is wonderful. And it's going to be this awesome product that I'm launching that has nothing wrong with it. But that's not how we see technology now, right? Because if we could help and we don't fully play out those harmful scenarios, the intent to protect is never there. We can say it is. We can say, "Oh, we have a center, you can report something." But that's like a tokenized way of approaching this, right? So I think what's missing is with those lived experience experts that know what this could actually have as an effect on individuals, whether that's in a DV situation, whether that's a teenager in the middle of the night feeling anxious about something going on, whether it's extortion for the issue that I was going through with, talking about it with my son. All of those have to play a part in the discussion, but you can't do that as an engineer who's never experienced that, right? You have to bring in those people from the onset as part of the design before you start to actually build something out. So the intent without lived experience is incomplete, in my opinion. And that's really the bigger gap that I'm seeing structurally is a blind spot for our technology firms that are building out these products.
You talked a little bit about this cooperative model and the survivor-centered design process. And elsewhere, I've heard you talk about Parasol as, and I'll quote here, founded upon a foundation of lived experience of violence survivors and advocates. I've heard you talk a little bit about what it means in practice to design with and not just for survivors. But I'd also like to hear you talk about what gets not only solved through that process, but also complicated.
I mean, one of the bigger things is people get triggered, right? And as you're talking to them, you may come across situations where people are very uncomfortable. So
Working.
understanding how you engage with someone that may have that lived experience that they're bringing in, the communication becomes important in that instance. And so, when we talk about bringing survivors together for us, we always talk about, hey, listen, some of these things would be triggering. If you need us to stop, let us know. We'll stop. We'll start talking about what's going on. Sometimes, and this can happen more often than not, and I do this sometimes too, is it'll be a trauma dump, right? Where someone is so triggered that they will just divulge everything in front of this sort of group of people that may trigger other people in the process, right? So understanding the re-traumatization aspect of these dialogues is one of the areas that I would caution people to make sure that you have the right framework, the right conversation set up, and the individuals that are in the room that also have that advocacy background that can help to tailor those conversations in a way that's healthy for everyone, right? I think where a lot of these sort of designs sessions could break down is really the power dynamics as well, right? There's a risk of designing these sessions in a way that we can start talking about all the different ways that we can collect it and process it. But I think when we start going in with a problem, we should be open to understanding where some of the underlying root causes are for that problem. And we don't do that often enough, right? So in these sessions, a lot of times, people used to get frustrated with me when I asked the 5 whys, right? Like, that's like the core of figuring out what the root cause is and being able to solve for the specific issue that you're dealing with. But in doing so, we were able to uncover a very interesting set of 2 situations that survivors are really struggling with. One was this access to information with Ruth that we solved for, and the other one was navigating and getting the right sort of, services scheduled, which is it seems so basic, right? To be able to schedule something. But the only way we were able to do that is because we brought them into the room to better understand, but not only the survivors with lived experiences, we had brought advocates into the room as well that could say on the flip side why they weren't able to fulfill those services, right? So bridging the gap between the individual that needs the service and then the people that are providing that service became increasingly important in order to ensure we had a balanced system that we were putting together. And so if I think about sort of this monolithic survivor perspective that needs to be brought in, experiences can conflict. People can have problems, but there are ways that you can navigate that by holding yourself accountable for what's going on, but also flattening that experience so that everybody understands each other's point of view so that it's a balanced outcome. And so in that cooperative model, what you get is governance, right? You get governance from a perspective that you hadn't previously considered. So in our case, we're starting to look at survivors being consultants, paid consultants to do the work that we're doing so that they have the financial support they need, which is a gap in the industry today. We bring people in saying we want your experience, but never compensate them, right? And then there's the second part of it, which is really understanding the different stakeholders involved in supporting these individuals. All their information is also important and they should be compensated fairly as well. And so creating a committee of people that are compensated as consultants that are brought in for their experiences that you can then help to develop a more even keel approach to those user sessions that are bringing in the design considerations you need to take into account.
You and I are having this conversation in a moment where there is quite a bit of political controversy and public attention on dimensions of uh, abuse, particularly abuse where power and technology meet that abuse. Just to reference two that come to mind, the epic settlement in New Mexico and in California over Facebook permitting channels of communication between children and people who were obviously seeking to connect with those children in predatory ways of children who are harmed from this, increasing scrutiny on CSAM or child sexual abuse material, and of course, the Epstein controversy that is present in deeply saturated ways in our culture in this particular moment as the files have been recently elevated to public attention. I'm wondering how you're thinking about Reed in this particular public moment where this issue, particularly related to children and sexual abuse, is taking up so much attention in ways that in the past hasn't been the case. This is an issue that famously, in the context of the Epstein child, was deeply neglected and suppressed. And in the context of something like Facebook's unwillingness or recalcitrance at that to deal with the issue has not given this issue the attention that I think it lately deserved. How do you think about the product in this particular moment and the activity of what we're doing in the context of our political ecosystem?
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of politics, I'm not sure I would have like a big opinion on this because I think every 4 years we're going to have a wave of different opinions coming through from the government. I think accountability sits squarely with the people that are building these products, period. I wouldn't say any other way. I think when you have a leader in an organization that is building these types of products, aligning with whoever's coming in and appeasing to whoever's coming into the office, I think that's where we start to have major issues. Now, child sexual abuse materials, different types of extortion issues that are happening on Instagram, the addiction of the youth to social media, all of those affect me personally because I have a teenager myself, right, who is always on YouTube shorts. And I think there isn't a perfect answer for this. But what I do think we need to start having more of is the accountability and holding us as our leadership and ourselves accountable for what our organizations are doing and committing to doing. Right. In this case, I think it was proven that Meta had known about these issues and didn't act on them. Right. And I think when you have a large behemoth of an organization, many times you don't know who's making what decisions. But I think in the case of child safety, it should be, as a leader, a priority for you to ensure whatever you're building has the safeguards for younger demographics, period. No matter where you go with the product, you need to ensure you're building them. Now, a lot of times that can mean restrictive access, but we all were teenagers. I remember cutting corners to try to get what I want, right? And unfortunately, there are many kids who will put in the wrong information and get the access regardless. So, how can we as parents make sure that whatever our kids are using is something we know as well, right? A lot of times, the newer technologies, parents are not very aware of what they're using. And so they can't really govern it at home nor create any guidelines or conversation around it except it's banned. And at that point, anytime someone tells you you can't do something, that's the first thing you want to do, unfortunately. And so for me, accountability, at least for Parasol, I can speak to it. Building an organization and assuming it grows at the pace that it is at this point, the personal accountability that I'm bringing in is something that every single team member on my team today brings in. Each of us has a role to play in the part of protecting people, and our mission is literally protect people through the use of technology, right? And I would hope that other organizations take that as well. We can't put it on our board. We can't put it on our employees. We can't put it on the committees that sit there and govern everything we're doing. We have to ask those right questions. And I typically use a military analogy from when I was in junior ROTC program, where if your battalion or your team did something wrong, it was on you, not the team, because you should have spotted that. You should have asked the right questions. And if you didn't see that happening, you needed to make sure that that was happening, right? So the real check is on us is the people that we serve must also raise their voices, must also ensure that we collectively act based on what we feel is a trusted system. Ruth has been wildly successful. We have done no marketing on it. So why has it been successful? It's because we hold it to the same standard we would want our kids to be using it, right? I can't tell you how many times I've told my son, you can use Ruth anytime you want. And the reason I can say that proudly is because we built in those checks and balances. Now, yes, if I one day wake up and say, I may have the wrong mindset in terms of my own values, well, in that case, someone else on my team needs to make sure that that's checked. And someone on my board needs to ask that question. And so we're also developing an ethics committee that is actually putting together a rubric and framework to make sure we as an organization eat our own pie at the end of the day. Because if we are not able to hold ourselves to a higher standard, we cannot expect someone else to be at a higher standard. And so having that sort of radical accountability of what our actions are makes us into a more trustful organization, but also helps us to make sure that we ourselves are able to serve the community in a way that previously wasn't possible.
I want to bring in something personal because I had an experience that changed how I think about these systems, and how I think about Ruth, how I think about AI systems, how I think about seeing a person in this particular moment on the internet. I work in ethics, privacy, and technological governance. And when I had this experience of being harassed online, I still saw myself completely unprepared for how sophisticated digitally mediated harassment can be when it becomes targeted and thing. I've spent, a decade in this space. I had a fellowship at ADL where I worked on online hate and harassment specifically. But what I experienced led me to understand how different it is to know these things in theory and to work on the issues from the technical perspective or even the political perspective. And then on the other hand, how it feels to actually navigate the internet as somebody who is being harassed in that ecosystem. And what I experienced was not just a single message that was threatening or an obvious crime, but something much more diffuse and modern.
which many people, I think, may have had some experience of. There were boundary violations, there was reputation of pressure, unwanted contact, psychological destabilization, cognitive overload, just trying to manage and figure out what I was going to do in response, things that led me incapacitated to do anything else. And they finally the use of ordinary platforms, things that I used every day, interacted with every day, in ways that created persistent fear for me in using those things. While at the same time, just staying right inside the lines of what a system might easily recognize or enforce as harassment, and that might have consequences that would stop it. And it made me realize just how much of our safety infrastructure is built around clear, discrete incidents, while in reality, much of the harm is cumulative and ambient and difficult to classify. From your perspective, where do current technologies most fail people who are facing this kind of coercive or stalking behavior? And what would it look like to design systems that take patterned harm seriously before it escalates?
I mean, I'm gonna go back to lived experience experts again. I've never heard of a single person that said it was a simple little thing that happened. It's never simple. All of these things are so subtle that it's hard to figure out how to navigate it because you just don't know where to turn in that moment. Like I know actual people that have been practicing advocacy work for so long that themselves struggled when they faced a situation, right? And so I think in the I guess the way that I would say this is there's systems that are built in order to serve a specific purpose, right? And then there's systems that are built just for the sake of making money or revenue. And I think a lot of times, we don't understand how people are approaching these solutions. And so transparency becomes one of the things that can really help, but also regular check ins. And what I mean by that is when a system acknowledges that they made a mistake on how something was categorized or how something was classified or how they determined something was abusive or not, if we rely solely on algorithms that have been built on logical ones and zeros, you're never going to get to that outcome. And so understanding a human experience is very different than saying, okay, based on this, the logical next step would be to report it. Well, when they report it, it doesn't seem like abuse because they're just reaching out. But what they don't understand is that potentially this person has been reaching out to you through multiple channels. And so that's why this is becoming an issue, right? And many people can't formulate that thinking when they're in that moment. And that's largely because of just the way our biology works. And so if we can give systems, let's take for Meta, for instance, in this case, right? Which is they have so many cases in Snapchat and in Instagram and in WhatsApp and in iMessages, where people, young teenage boys, were being contacted through all of those mediums by a single group of people that was sextorting them. Now, if they reported them on Instagram, that's one platform. Then they have to go to Snapchat and report them on Snapchat. Then they have to go to iMessages and Apple and say, this is the issue here. Well, what if we as technologists came together to understand that there's a daisy chain here? That there's a different set of platforms that are being used for the same purpose. And on top of that, now we've layered on AI, where you have voice mimicking, you have actual image mimicking, you have so many different ways that people are using technology to abuse. Well, if we just took a moment as technologists who solve these really complex problems to understand how it's being abused, I think we'll start to put better solutions in place. Right. And the only way we can do that, and I will tell you, even if I tell people that, hey, this was my lived experience, unless they live it themselves, they will never fully connect with that. And so getting to a point where they not only, and I wouldn't say we want them to experience it, don't get me wrong here. I do want them to understand the consequences of what happens when we isolate these issues as issue one, issue two, issue three, platform one, platform two, platform three, right? Instead, we need to look at this as a holistic issue. So if I report it on Instagram as an issue, I should be able to say this is also happening on these 3 platforms, and that should then be taken very seriously, right? And it should be a human reviewing it and not an artificial intelligence reviewing it. So the answer isn't as simple in terms of a technological solution where we need to head with this, right? But I do think that it's important to ensure that coercers that are using these types of platforms are exposed in such a way. I mean, we created an April Fool's campaign, and we called it Bubbles for Bros. Um, and the reason we called it Bubbles for Bros was because, Meta had come up with a solution to their avatars in the metaverse where a large portion of them were women that were getting sexually harassed in the metaverse. Their avatars were. And so they put bubbles around the women and the men that were getting harassed online. To me, that was backwards. Why are we putting bubbles around people that are affected? Why not put a bubble around the person that actually doing the affecting, right? If we put it around them, now we know who those perpetrators are, and that's less likely to create additional fraudulent or additional harm to other people, right? So turning the tables on this is very important. But, if I were to honestly say that we're going to have the right answer for this and it's going to be the perfect solution, I would be delusional to say that, right? There is no perfect answer to this. And this is why it's so complex to solve. But I think, again, cooperative, we have to cooperate with each other in order to address these primary issues that we're seeing with so many people. I mean, domestic violence survivors, 98% of them, according to National Network to End Domestic Violence, reported that they were getting abused through technology. So it's not new. This is something we know as a fact. Why aren't we doing something more about it? And why aren't we talking to the people that are affected by these to ensure that we can probe into those issues further and develop solutions that are more proactive rather than reactive?
One of the issues that comes up for me when you talk about this, particularly the idea that every human experience should be viewed by a human in this way, is the question of scale. Imagine that Ruth becomes wildly successful, and you have people all over the world using it in large, significant population proportions. How do you stage boss? How do you scale the work that he is doing with the emphasis on human review and the kinds of considerations you have about the individual experience? How do you scale that without becoming the kind of institution you were built to collect?
I think that's the hardest question that I can answer on this podcast. But I think it's a very important one, right? We can't remove human beings from the equation. Can humans make mistakes? Yes. Can artificial intelligence make mistakes? Yes. But that shouldn't be the reason that we just say, well, that's not possible, right? I think we need to get to a point where we understand what that balance really looks like. So, right now, what we've started to do for Parasol anyway is as we partner with more and more organizations that work in the advocacy space, we've developed a process and a governance standard almost to do quality checks on responses of the transcripts by people that are qualified to do that, right? So, for instance, with the domestic violence hotline, for instance, they do quality checks on phone calls. The same applies for the technology side of this, right? And so they look at the responses that the AI is building, they send us the feedback. We actually have a product pipeline of review that we do on the issues that are coming up, whether that's a resource inaccuracy, whether that is a response inaccuracy, harmful response, potentially. What are those different situations that others are seeing? So creating a network effect while we grow is how we address that in terms of trust. Because if we go off and try to do this on our own, this is going to be nearly impossible to do. And so if I'm able to partner with organizations that already do this today, that can then be trained to help you bridge that gap between technology and the service that they're providing, I think we can start to really make a pretty impactful change as we go. Right. So National DV Org is just one of the orgs that we work with. We have our internal team that does the quality checks as well. We have our external other partners that we're working with in the human trafficking space that do the same thing. And each of those issues, experts are being coming together to figure out what are ways that we're addressing this right or wrong. In some cases, they may come back and say, we've got feedback on it's not ADA compliant right now. how we built it, right? And so we'll put it into the pipeline as a priority area to work through from a feature standpoint. In some cases, we'll get feedback saying, the response for a younger person should be less complex, right? In which case, we would look at it from a engineering standpoint and say, okay, that's great, but can we talk with an expert in this space that can tell us what's the right framing for this response, and then make sure that as the AI is generating that response, that we're able to articulate it in a way that that age group can understand it, right? So building trust isn't just about me building it. It's building it with the people that are actually with me in this equation of solving problems for survivors. So I can bring the tech chops, but I'm not an expert advocate, right? Someone else is. So can I pair up with them to make sure that we continuously grow together as part of this cooperative model and ensure that whatever we put out there is actually helping us achieve our mission of being able to protect people?
What keeps you up at night? What do you think about the intersection of AI abuse and vulnerable population?
I mean,
In
there's so much concern for me right now. I think that if I were to pull it back to the root cause of some of the things, AI is trained on data at the end of the day. And we as a community that has access to creating all this data, right? Maybe we need to take a break and stop creating the data that's actually helping abusers harm us in the process. If our data as a community is sitting out there on the internet and we're not cleaning it up, and I'm guilty of that, right? That creates a whole host of other things that AI can facilitate abuse in a much more powerful way. So if people that are building these technologies understand that APIs that you're giving out to people as part of just building a chatbot on their own, you can bet people are building chatbots that are going out and researching all this information through the search capability. They're able to build an entire persona on a person just because their data is available online. For Europeans, people that are in other countries that have strict data privacy laws that don't have their data just sitting out there, that's why they're not seeing as high of a crime in that space than here in the United States. In the US alone, we've had $10 billion worth of money taken from people just through financial fraud. That's a lot of money. And the only reason they're able to do that so easily with the use of any technology and AI being as powerful as it is, that has been sort of the go-to at this point, right? So in a moment of clarity, I think it's time for us to understand how to remove our information from the internet and from the companies we no longer use, our products or services or whoever it is, right? And understand that apps you're downloading on your phone because they're free, they're actually harvesting data on your phone. Figure out what that is and don't give that permission, right? I mean, every time my son downloads an app, I actually talk to him. I was like, okay, what data is it using? Is it okay for them to get this information from you? Is it safe for them if it leaks to go somewhere else? But these are questions that I can ask because I am a technologist. Not everybody has the sort of ability to do that, right? Which is another reason why we created Ruth the way we did was you can go there and ask these questions and understand it. So what keeps me up is AI is in the hands of these abusers, and we are shying away from using AI to actually do good in the world. And so we have to get to a point where we have to be more proactive like they are in using the latest technologies to defend against these abusers. And that's really what I hope for as part of what we're doing with Parasol.
Megs, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was wonderful.